and Placer counties.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Nevada County Interviews. I'm your host, Paul Minicucci. And this evening we're going to be talking about the Non GMO Movement with a Nevada County person, Michael Funk, who's well known in these parts. Welcome to the set, Michael.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, Michael, you're a man of many positions here. I mean, you're the president and board of directors of the Non GMO Project, and we'll be talking about that. And you're also, of course, the co-founder and chairman of United Natural Foods. Used to be called Mountain
People's Warehouse. I founded Mountain People's Warehouse in 1976. Been operating it out of Nevada County since 1977, actually. Started working out of a garage on Lake Vero Road, selling organic produce, and it's now grown to be the largest wholesale distributor of natural and organic foods in the world, with sales of $5 billion, and it's a Fortune 500 company.
So. Right. Let's go back and ask you where you're from. We talked off camera, and you said you were from Sacramento.
I grew up in Sacramento. Yeah, I spent my formative years growing up there, and I used to, my first exposure to Nevada County was driving the delivery trucks. There was a handful of stores back in the 70s that wanted our product, and once I got up here and I finished the end of the deliveries, I just couldn't bear to drive back to Sacramento, so I had to figure out a way to move up here, bring my family, and operate the company out of here.
How did you first become aware of natural foods and organic farming and that kind of thing?
Well, you know, growing up as part of the counterculture, as you might say, in the early 70s, I was reading a lot of information about the concerns and dangers of pesticides, herbicides, chemicals in the diet overall, and health concerns. And I wanted to make sure I changed my diet to avoid those things as much as possible, and that led me to be, to get into this business ultimately. So. Yeah,
and so when you first started out, I take it, I mean, the market isn't what it is today. Right? I mean, you didn't have near as much demand.
You know, it's funny. We always joke that when we started, there was no supply and no demand. The quality of products was really poor. You know, people thought about an organic apple as something with a worm in it, something where the fruit flies were buzzing over it, and. You know, I remember buying things like my first organic black beans had rocks the size of black beans. Right. And so quality was a problem. Getting the proper supply, and then of course demand was very low. Although in Nevada County, you know, we were very fortunate. We had stores like Good Morning in the late 70s on Broad Street. Many of the old timers will remember that store. We had in Grass Valley Nature's Way. Those were a couple of stores that predated Briar Patch and California Organics. And of course on the Ridge there was Mother Truckers, and the Ananda community always had a store as well. So it really served as a kind of a solid foundation of demand for a relatively small county. And, you know, I've told people this before, but when we've done per capita research on large cities across the country, Nevada County and Nevada City, Grass Valley in particular, rank as high as 4 or 5 times higher per capita demand on consumption of natural and organic foods. So it's pretty amazing what's happening here locally.
Yeah, it's true. And so originally your company was involved mostly in produce?
Yeah, it started out with organic produce. Back then, there wasn't really a definition of organic, so we sourced unsprayed. We tried to find the cleanest produce we could, but it wasn't until 1980 where California adopted a actual organic law, and then of course it was years later. The federal government, through the USDA, adopted a national standard. But in the early days, it was kind of like the Wild West, you know.
Right. Organic meant a lot of things.
Meant a lot of things to a lot of different people.
Yeah, we used to call it, did you buy some ugly fruit?
Yeah.
So then as demand grew, though, and we talked off camera about the difficulty of using produce as your core product because it's difficult. It's got a very small margin by comparison. And you moved into other foodstuffs. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think from early on we realized that produce was a tough way to make a living, and that our customers wanted a broad range of products. So, we got into dried fruit and nuts, got into grains, bulk flours, ultimately dairy products, cheeses, yogurts. And today, we have virtually everything you would find in a natural product store. I think something like 50,000 products. So from those early days of produce, we definitely expanded to become the full line distributor.
And so, how many retailers nationwide carry your products? Would you say?
I think over 25,000, something like that. Yeah.
And you did tell us that you do have a relationship with Whole Foods, for example.
Whole Foods is our largest customer right now. Yeah,
which is I think a good thing for people to know. And so naturally, the Briar Patch is here locally is a major company.
Briar Patch has done a tremendous job, and they are part of a National Cooperative Grocers Association, which we are the primary supplier to. They're actually, the NCGA, as we call it, is our number 2 customer.
Great. So now I would imagine in the early 70s and 80s, pesticides were the major issue that organics would have to deal with.
Yeah, after World War II, a lot of the chemical companies had all these leftover chemicals from the war, and they figured out they could be used for chemical fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. And we saw the explosion of the Green Revolution, where they promised us that these chemicals would feed the world. They would increase yields in farming and changed the way agriculture, operated, and they did many of those things. But they also brought with them a lot of dangers that took many, many years for everybody to realize. I think DDT was in 1946 touted as, the savior for agriculture, and that it was thoroughly tested. Blah blah blah. Well, it took till 1972 to actually outlaw it. So many of those same companies that are the largest agrochemical companies are also the companies that control the genetically modified seed market.
When would we say is the demarcation point for genetically modified foodstuff? I mean, when did it become practical?
Well, actually, probably you could go back to the 80s when the foundation of the patent laws were created to set the stage for what would be the GMO explosion in the 90s. It was really the mid to late 90s that the explosion of GMO plantings happened. But those wouldn't have occurred if the patent law hadn't been cleared. They had to decide that you could patent life virtually, and so once that happened in the, I think, late 80s, they were clear for takeoff to what we see today.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more as we go about what products the profusion in corn and soy and other products. But first I want to talk a little bit about your project, the Non GMO Movement. Tell me how that started.
Well, I don't know, it was probably several years, 6 years ago maybe, where a lot of the retailers were calling us and asking us to identify what products they could be sure did not have any GMOs ingredients or any GMO contamination. And as we started looking into it, we realized that very few people were doing any kind of testing, and there was a lot of basically people looking the other way when it came to tracking the GMO sources that were in our food. So the project was kind of launched to first of all get a standard that defined what GMO-free meant.
Right.
You know,
Let's talk about that. What is that standard? What's that definition?
Well, we basically looked at what Europe was doing. In 1999, Europe adopted a label law, which basically said if you are going to have any GMOs in this product, and they set a threshold of 0.9%, so they allowed for some kind of trace contamination. Because they realized you can't really get to zero. So they set that threshold, and they basically mandated that if you're going to have over 0.9, you would have to label it as such in the EU. So to this day, there's virtually no GMOs in Europe because the consumers don't want it. They don't want to see a label that says this product contains GMOs. It's basically like putting a skull and crossbones on it. So in our situation here, before we could accurately talk about whether GMOs are in the product or not, we had to set a similar standard, and we basically chose the EU model, and we used 0.9 as a threshold. And only in our case, we're labeling it if it's under 0.9, we're labeling it as a GMO-free product, as opposed to what EU is doing, which is they're doing the opposite, saying you have to label it,
Gotcha.
the other direction.
So what happens in a genetically modified food or plant? What's going on there? I mean, the chemists have created certain traits that that are not natural to that plant stuff to increase yield, weight, size, color.
Well, the biotech companies, and these include, again, the largest agrochemical companies, in the world: DuPont, Monsanto, Syngenta. These companies, they have they've developed this technology of transgenic DNA manipulation, so they can take DNA from one species and insert it into another species, something that would never happen in the natural world, and that's the process we're concerned about. That's those are the traits that we're trying to identify, because we think there's a number of concerns that we can talk about. But the technology itself has increased greatly. They've promised us different traits like increased yields, drought resistant, nutritional superiority, but in fact they haven't delivered on any of those other traits. What they've really delivered us is in traits that are primarily herbicide resistant, so that farmers can plant more or can spray more herbicides on their plants without killing their soybeans, as an example. And what that technology has led to is increased applications of herbicides. The other trait that's out there in the corn world is a built-in insecticide called Bt that is bred into the plant itself, so the plant's producing its own insecticide. But none of those things have anything to do with drought-resistant, nutritional superiority, or increased yield. So a lot of this has been hype. It doesn't mean that they may not develop things in the future, but today that's what we're seeing.
And so, in general, we're looking at the FDA regulating this industry, or not regulating, as it might be?
We feel like the industry has been given a free pass on the whole regulatory situation. In the 90s, FDA basically said a GMO corn is the same as a conventional corn. There's no difference between the two. Any tests that were done by the companies that were producing the product themselves. So obviously, very, very biased. There was never any independent, peer-reviewed scrutiny applied to these. So that, it should have been under FDA's, regulatory system to stop it or to actually have some additional testing done. Now today, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, is responsible for the approvals of new crops. And so that's where we're seeing approvals happening today under the USDA.
Mm-hmm. So now, so we have some slides we want to put up there that talk a little bit about some things you've been doing. So here's a slide that introduces us to the Non GMO Movement, and it's a kind of an interesting tagline. Your right to know, is that kind of basic idea here?
Yeah, we're the Non GMO Project Verified label there is what you see in the top right. So that's the label we're trying to get on different products to show consumers that they are they can buy that product with confidence. But yeah, right to know seems like a basic American right. When it comes to food, we all should be able to know what's in our products. We have labels that tell us exactly what the nutritional content is, what all the ingredients are, and we feel like we should be able to know if the product we're buying contains genetically modified ingredients or not. In many countries around the world, all the EU, Japan, Korea, Australia, there are label laws in the same way. So, yeah, we're trying to focus on a consumer's right to know as the primary argument, for this.
In the next slide, I'm not a science experiment. We really are experimenting on our families and children, aren't we?
I think so. I mean, I think, while the biotech would argue that they've been planting these crops for, over a decade now, and there hasn't been any ill effects, I would argue that the analogy with pesticides and herbicides, I think, is very similar in that we started applying all these chemicals to our food and to our land and found years later, and sometimes decades later, what the cumulative impact was. And I think with GMOs, when you consider the mass plantings that have been going on the last 10 years, we don't know if there are unintended consequences. And I know we'll touch upon maybe some of the health concerns later, but in many ways, I think it's similar to the pesticide revolution we saw earlier.
And I think particularly since you're dealing with plants and animals, and animals who eat plants, and then they're bred, and who knows how many generations before something deleterious might show up, some genetic defect. We just don't know.
We don't.
So recently, I know you participated in a march from New York to Washington.
Yeah, there was a march in October to kind of bring awareness to GMO, about the GMO issue, about the right to know issue. A group of marchers marched from New York to Washington, D.C., where there was a rally held. I was able to speak there and took my family, and we got to bring some awareness to the issue. I think last year in general was a big year for the awareness of the GMO movement. You had a lot of people reading about GMO salmon. They were, the FDA is still considering approving GMO salmon. Alfalfa was approved for the first time, which is a major forage crop for the dairy industry. I think there was several reports out about potential health concerns, allergy concerns. So 2011 was a big year for awareness, and I think it's building. We're going to see a lot more of it this year.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the awareness is regional? I mean, is California a little bit more aware than people in the Midwest might be?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think you could say that if you look at the demographics of where, organic food is sold, for example, both coasts have always been where the main concentration, but that's changed over the last 10 years. It's now broadened out into mainstream America. If you think about where you can buy organic food today, every conventional supermarket sells it pretty much. So it tells you. More and more people are interested in this. I think 12% of all produce sold in the United States today is organic. 6% of all dairy is sold as organic. So, and those are big markets we're talking about.
Right.
So it's the fastest growing part of the food industry, has been for the last 20 years. No reason to think it's going to stop. I think in general you see a more educated consumer who wants to know more about their food, wants a deeper connection to where it comes from.
Right. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this, that there is a linkage between the non-GMO and the organic movement. And in other words, you can piggyback one on the other. I mean, if organics are free of GMOs, then, the popularity of the organic movement should be the main place I think we should see the growth.
Yeah, I mean, the consumers who are buying organic food definitely don't want to be consuming GMOs. So it's a primary concern. But I think it also leaches into more conventional shoppers who are starting to hear about this. And when in polls that have been done by MSNBC and others, it shows a significant portion of the population, when asked the question, do you want to consume genetically engineered foods, say overwhelmingly no.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the issues here, is that this movement, the GMO movement, came on so quickly, and it is biotech. People tend to think that's a good thing.
Right.
It's progressive, biotech, and it's sort of overwhelmed us without having people really understand what's happening. So let's go over that. We have some slides here, I think, to talk about what GMO production in the U.S. is. We as we see, corn, soy, cotton, sugar beet, and canola.
Yeah, these just show you the overwhelming amounts of acreage in the U.S. that the GMO crops have taken in a very short period of time. Corn and soy have been, since the late 90s. But if you look at sugar beets, 95% of the acreage is now GMO. That's only been 2 years they've been, deregulated. So it's unbelievable. And alfalfa was just deregulated, so we're seeing plantings of that today. And, for people really interested in this, the amount of test products or trial products going on are huge. They're virtually experimenting with everything, you know, and so there's no we could be looking at a majority of your crops being in some kind of GMO production if there's not a change in the consumer reaction to this.
Yeah. We might have a pot-bellied salmon with 4 legs.
They do have a GMO pig, it's called the Enviro pig.
Yeah.
And it's bred to have its waste have 40% less phosphorus, so that they can cram them in smaller quarters and not have the problems of toxic waste. I mean, it's just crazy, some of the things that are going on.
Right. If you can think of it, you can do it. So the figures we're talking about: corn, soy, cotton. We're talking about corn sold to the consumer as well as corn sold for livestock.
Yeah, well, primarily when you look at corn and soy acreage, the bulk of that product is being produced for animal feed. Right. So that's where most of it goes. The U.S., as that slide demonstrated, is by far the largest grower of these crops. I think basically half of the world's production is in the U.S., and we have been trying to export this technology in sometimes very forceful ways to other countries. Many countries have been pushing back significantly, but you can see here where the penetration is. Brazil and Argentina primarily after the U.S.
And do we have to worry about India and China?
Well,
such large populations.
Yeah, certainly. It'll be interesting to see what their, what their consumers how they react to this. It's interesting. In other parts of the world, consumers seem much more educated and aware about the potential dangers of this technology. And there's other more basic things like with this technology, GMO seed. Farmers don't save their seed year after year like they've been doing for millennia. And that in itself, to a more agricultural-based economy where farmers can't save their seed, the reaction is not real positive.
Right. And, I think the size feature is part of the issue. I mean, we're talking, there's a relationship between the large mega farms and GMOs and smaller, family-owned farms and, countries like India. I'm sure they don't have the mega farms quite yet. Yeah,
most of you have much smaller acreage, and as well as when you talk about saving seed, and you've been developing your family, you've been developing seed for your microclimate. In some of these countries, they're huge countries. They have tons of different ecosystems and different climates. Your seed is best adapted for your particular situation. And then when biotech comes in and has a one-size-fits-all, it doesn't always work that way, that it can really perform in optimum situations. So
now, off camera, you told me essentially there's 5 kinds of corn, varieties of corn that are grown today as opposed to the hundreds that used to be.
Yeah, the biodiversity here, the loss of diversity is, I think, something a country, whether you're conservative or liberal or what, that you should be concerned about. If you're concerned about homeland security, you should be concerned about our food security, because we had thousands of varieties of corn at one time. Now, like you say, we're planting maybe 5 varieties for 90% of our crop. That puts us in a very vulnerable situation as a country, as a nation. So that's one of the top concerns about this technology.
It's like any portfolio. The more you have, you balance it out. If you only have 5 kinds and something comes along that happens to affect those 5 varieties, you're really taking years to survive. So now we had another slide about groceries. You see up there?
Yeah, this kind of just highlights the fact that corn and soy are in so many processed foods. When you think about corn flour, corn oil, high fructose corn syrup, all the soy derivatives, they're in a tremendous amount of processed food. So while many people feel like they're not consuming genetically engineered foods, this is a kind of a wake-up call to say, if you're buying processed food in a conventional store and it's not organic, chances are you are consuming a great deal of GMOs.
And I think that's probably one of the major points we're going to have to make to people in terms of understanding what this process is, because there's these bedrock organisms that feed the whole, the whole agricultural industry, and you think you're eating, soup or something else, and in fact you're consuming products, soy products, whatever, they're GMO. Mm-hmm. And so we talked a little bit about the list of common foods and ingredients, and that slide is up there now. So you see milk, meat, and eggs. What's the point of this?
Well, again, because corn and soy are so prevalent with GMOs, and they are the primary feed for much of our animal food. So if it's dairy or if it's meat or even eggs, there's a high concentration of corn and soy with animal food. So certainly that's one area where people are consuming it, as well as the more direct applications of corn with all the corn chips and the corn flour, the soy foods. Now we have again, alfalfa. We have sugar beets. So sugar. Now all of a sudden we want to be concerned about, is it cane sugar or is it sugar from beets, if we're trying to avoid it. So there's a number of places here to get educated for consumers to want to make sure if they're choosing to avoid it, there's a lot of work to do to figure it out.
Right. And if I went into the store and picked up some eggs, I wouldn't know whether they were GMO or not, unless they were organic. Is that
The bottom line is, if you're trying to avoid GMOs, buying organic is the safest, easiest thing to do. We'll talk later about, additional insurance is to get non-GMO verified products, which can add another layer of assurance to the consumer.
Right. And you talked about a list of products that we didn't show it on the screen, but just, corn oil, corn starch, modified corn starch, corn syrup, dextrose, enzymes, flavorings, so forth and so on. And corn is, basic crop. And if you enter it there and you get 95% of that as GMO, you're really passing it on.
Corn is almost in everything. The thing that I remember finding out that knocked me for a loop was that vitamin C, or ascorbic acid, is made from corn. And so when you think about that, I mean,
right. It's not just sunshine, huh?
You pick up a vitamin C and there's a picture of an orange on it, and you think,
right, yeah.
what? And it's really actually corn. So they've figured out a lots to do with corn in particular, as well as soy. So,
in terms of the political infrastructure, the support for GMOs really comes out of the big companies that we talked about before: Bayer, Syngenta, Monsanto, DuPont. These guys know their way around the legislatures of our country, and so probably part of the issue is both in terms of educating consumers, about their own health, but part of it is educating consumers so that they can begin to understand what the impacts are, so that they can influence legislation or influence their legislators. And if they don't know, I would assume. My experience, I'll be the one sued here instead of, I worked in the legislature, and my experience was that unless it's destabilized, you can assume that most legislators, because it's so expensive to run, are taking money from major organizations and major corporations. It's just the way it is, and so you have to fight a sort of a rear action battle to get consumers to understand what that issue is, so that they could put pressure on the legislators, so the legislators will say, "Oh my, yes, I didn't know that." Otherwise, things will remain as the status quo.
Yeah, politically, the biotech lobby is maybe second to none in terms of their influence and certainly their spending in terms of campaign contributions. They are. Right up there with the oil companies in terms of their strength. These are highly profitable, in many cases multinational companies. And like you say, biotech has been supported by the U.S. administrations since the 90s by both Republican and Democratic administrations. So they've been highly influential in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that we again are concerned about when it comes down to consumers getting information about this is, where are the independent, scientific, peer-reviewed data or testing on these crops? And in many cases, they don't exist. They don't exist because, number one, biotech is the only one that have conducted the tests, and that information isn't available to the public. And number two, these are patented products, and they control who gets to use them. So even a university who wants to do a test on the impacts of eating GMO corn, for example, in many cases can't get access to it because they'll use the patent law.
Even if they wanted to, even though something like 65-70% of graduate school work is supported by major corporations. Right. I was a professor at Virginia Tech for a couple of years, and it was amazing. They had a little mini corporate park where all these labs were, and each one had the logo out front. Monsanto was there among other ones, and so they contribute to the universities. And every time, what I tell people is, every time you pull $1 out of UC, you're allowing $1 from major corporations to fill that, and that's part of the insidious part of that. Is so the scientists grow up on this, they get recruited into the field, and there isn't much independence going on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So now, one might ask, well, what are the concerns? Why should we care? And I know we have a slide here on potential health concerns. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, the health concerns, again, a lot of the people will say, well, is there proof that these things are harmful? And the answer is the evidence is very sketchy. There's been more research being done in the EU that's been surfacing. There's been a few independent scientific areas that have been, potentially showing problems. This slide shows, reproductive issues is one very, very severe concern. The allergy issue has been something that we've seen an explosion of allergies in the last 10, 12 years, and everybody keeps wondering what's going on. Everybody's allergic to something now, and potentially could this could be an issue. There are just a number of things that we feel like need further study, further review, and that until these things are proved safe, I'd rather err on the side of caution. There's something called the precautionary principle, which says prove these things safe before we consume them, as opposed to let's consume them and then find out, whoops, there's a problem. And I think that's kind of what we're doing right now. That goes back to the slide on the science experiment. We're kind of all being guinea pigs right now, and we'll see what happens.
And that's kind of an American trait, I think. Frustration is that we may make fun of people in Europe as a country, but they have that inbred precautionary kind of mentality that, a little cynical about major corporations coming in with something that's going to save the world. Well, here in America, it's like, it's the free market. And these guys are good guys. They wouldn't harm us, would they?
Yeah, exactly. And again, if we look at the track record of these companies, Monsanto itself has, they've produced DDT, Agent Orange, aspartame, the artificial sweetener that turned out to be carcinogenic. There's the track record on a lot of these companies isn't real good. So to me, I'm not gonna trust these companies without some real heavy data to back it up.
Then we have environmental concerns, so that the increased use of chemical herbicides and damage to wildlife and toxic water and soil organisms. And GE plants cross-pollinating with wild plants. That's an important part, because when we talked off stage. You were mentioning that the contamination is such that it's really hard to come up with pure seed for products that are non-GMO, because they're influenced through natural processes of pollination.
Yeah, once these things start getting into the environment, particularly when it's they're open pollinated, like corn is, like canola. A good example is they've discovered canola has cross-pollinated with wild mustard, which is a similar species, and now there's a new species of a man-made crop being grown out there. We have no idea what potential impacts of some of these things are. When it comes to wildlife, there's real concerns about the bee population that many people are pointing to potentially GMO corn in particular may be a cause of this. Butterfly populations. The increased herbicide use is probably the number one concern we have. These crops are significantly increasing the amount of herbicides and chemicals we're applying to our soil now, greatly year after year. And in doing so, we're seeing the rise of superweeds that are resistant to these herbicides. We saw this with pesticides earlier, where eventually bugs and plants get resistant to these things. We keep spraying year after year on them. And so now we're seeing particularly in some of the southeast states, large tracts of superweeds that the herbicides are having no impact on. So the farmers are having to now resort to spraying even more herbicides and even more toxic. A lot of farmers who are spraying Roundup Ready on the crops now are having to spray 2,4-D on the crop. 2,4-D is basically Agent Orange, and for anybody who remembers the Vietnam era, you know what we did to that country with Agent Orange. So now we're doing it to our own country.
Right. So we have health concerns, we have environmental concerns, and we have what may be the most important that evolves, food security concerns. And as you point out, as a national issue, we ought to be concerned about this, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, you know, the biodiversity of seed, the whole idea of patenting life, I think really needs to be looked at, you know, especially as they get further and further into this, and we start talking about different animal species being patented. You know, the idea that there's corporate control over our seed supply and potentially over our livestock supply, I think really needs to be re-examined. You know, farmers have, you know, right now no safety net or there's no liability protection for organic or a non-GMO farmer if they are contaminated by a GMO farmer. The government's not protecting that group at all right now. It certainly needs to be something addressed. You know, there's a group I worked with in New Mexico that kind of highlights one of the other issues. There are indigenous people who have been growing peppers for several thousand years. And their varieties of peppers, again, in that area of the world, there's a microclimate every valley over. And that pepper is designed specifically, has adapted to that microclimate. And now they're being threatened by trial plantings of GMO peppers. If they get contaminated, thousands of years of that cultural heritage to that group of people is wiped out. And that just seems like a crime against humanity.
Is anybody doing some seed banks? I mean, seed can last for a fairly long time.
Yeah, I mean, this is
bank seeds while we can.
This is a responsibility of the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and I know they are, you know, trying to beef this up. But I think not nearly enough have they gone, you know, worked on the diversity, preserving the diversity that we had.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about now. So we want consumers. So if I understand you correctly, we think that consumers would choose non-GMO products if they knew they had a choice, it was presented to them that way. What are we doing to try to influence retailers to make that clear to people?
Well, I think we're trying to educate. Part of the non-GMO project's work and the work with other is to, you know, educate consumers about what you can do to support non-GMO. And again, as we said, buying organic is number one, but also making sure that the organic folks are going through a testing program such as the non-GMO project, so we can be absolutely sure we're not allowing contamination to float through the supply chain. One of the areas that needs to be worked on is seed, because pure seed is the key to not only growing organically, but ensuring that genetic contamination doesn't continue on. If you start off planting GMO seed or seed that's contaminating, you're never going to get rid of it, right? So a lot of the seed companies have been avoiding testing and have been, not wanting to spend the money to do that. And so this is an area we have to ensure happens. That's all part of the project's work.
So who are your allies in the non-GMO project? I mean, who are potential allies and allies directly?
Well, I think the natural products industry. I mean, the organic foods industry. You know, people that are on our board are people like Lundberg Farms and Nature's Path Cereal, Eden Foods, longtime food companies, food manufacturers with a lot of integrity who passionately care about this. There's retailers. The co-ops have been actively involved. Whole Foods has been involved. independent natural food retailers across the country. We've been working with consumer groups as well. People like Center for Food Safety, who is kind of leading the legal battle on this, is involved. So in fact, there's a lot of groups working on this issue. People attacking the patent law, people looking at litigation, people working on label laws. So there's lots of allies out there right now.
Mm-hmm. And other than the corporations themselves, are there any folks who have a vested interest in fighting this movement?
Well, certainly, the biotech companies themselves, the people like National Corn Growers Association and National Soybeans, growers, they're locked into this technology right now, and not sure what it's going to take to get some of those growers off the program, but there's a huge agricultural lobby, and it's mostly supported by the government. The USDA has been in lockstep with those lobbies for a number of years. So it's a very powerful force and a very, as I've said to people, this is an uphill battle.
Mm-hmm. And the Grocers Association just standing on the sideline?
The Grocers Association, I think, for the most part, has been pro biotech, but it's interesting that there's some changes here. One interesting story is they just approved a new GMO corn called Amelise corn, and that corn was designed specifically for the ethanol industry. So if I'm a GMO corn grower growing that Amelise corn, and my corn contaminates your corn that you're growing for Frito-Lay, I can destroy your crop. Because obviously there's two very different traits that have been bred into those. So now the Grocery Manufacturers Association is saying, wait a minute, we have to control this stuff a little bit. And who knows where the next traits are coming from. So now we have an issue where GMO farmers are starting to worry about contaminating other GMO farmers. And that's where the need for regulation really is highlighted. It's time that the government really has to step in here and control this stuff.
Right. It seems to me logical to assume that we could use the litigation that has gone on with the pesticides and drift using the same logic that, you have a crop that has to be maintained for its seed, if not for no other reason. I'm getting drift that's destroying that proposition. Is that...
Yeah, there has been, cases settled where, chemical farmers have had to compensate organic or non-chemical farmers because of the drift that has gone on to their fields. And if you go way back to the days of, cattle farmers, who went out into your crop, it was your responsibility to fence those cattle in, and if they went into the next crop, you were responsible for damages. And really, in a very simplistic view, that's what's going on here today. But we, part of the work I'm doing in Washington D.C. On an advisory committee to the Secretary of Agriculture is trying to resolve this issue, and how can we compensate organic and non-GMO farmers from unintended, contamination. And it's a very contentious topic. We have.
What did the secretary say your job was as an advisory group?
Yeah, well, the secretary basically is supportive of all types of agriculture. He specifically said he supports GMO agriculture, he supports organic agriculture, and he supports conventional non-GMO agriculture. He wants them all to be able to prosper and thrive. So he wants a system where they all coexist. So that's easy to say. In reality, though, some kind of economic incentive has to be in place for the GMO growers to have, to be motivated enough where they put certain procedures in place where they're not contaminating their neighbors who might be organic or non-GMO. So there's a lot of work to do. But a lot of people think the USDA just pro-biotech, and Tom Vilsack is totally on biotech side. But I'll tell you, from direct experience of being with him and on this committee, I think he is really committed to a diverse agriculture situation, and he's very committed to rural America, and he sees organic in particular as a way of helping the small family farmer.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, can you foresee a time when we can protect organic farmers and non-GMO traditional farmers from GMOs, such that maybe something good comes out of the GMO movement? I mean, something where they really do produce more nutritious foods?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to predict the future. This technology, while I would say I think it's a failure up till now, there are other types of technology that use the new technologies of identifying DNA. There's this assisted marker technology which allows people to go into DNA and flip switches on or off, and it's not inserting different species in there. That type of technology could produce, and is producing, I think, some real advances in potentially yields and drought resistant and some of those other traits we're looking for. But I think it's important for us to keep an open mind and let other forms of agriculture be able to exist, and that's really our concern today. We don't want this one technology to make it impossible for an organic or a non-GMO grower to exist.
Right, and I think with the speed of change is so incredible that my sense of looking at the industry is that they want to jam as much out there as they can while they can, and so things are accelerating at a supernatural rate, and maybe just slowing down would be a good thing,
I mean, that's been my position, is we should have a moratorium on these new approvals at a minimum, give ourselves a chance to really study and research what's going on. I think right now there's 28 new applications in at the USDA for approvals of new GMO. Now, some of them are the USDA may approve, but the consumers, like they recently had a GMO apple that it wouldn't brown if you cut it open. I don't know if you read about that. Well, the Apple associations all said, we don't want this. We don't want to hurt our export markets, this and that. So ultimately, consumers have the power on this. If consumers reject that they don't want to eat this, the companies will stop making it.
Well, one of the things you talked about, too, off camera, was the idea that some of our companies make two different kinds of products. One for here, domestic product, that's used GMOs, and one that doesn't.
All the major manufacturers, from Kellogg's, Nestle's, you name it, have major businesses in Japan and Europe and Korea and Australia and all these places where the consumers have rejected GMOs, and they produce a non-GMO product over there. They'll do it if consumers demand it.
Yeah, that would be an interesting way to go. It's not a direct frontal attack, but to say, hey, I'd like the European version of this,
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think with the power of these companies, we're not going to get anything done in Washington, D.C. We're going to have to change this, kind of one consumer at a time, and that's the importance of things like the Non-GMO Project and other tools where people are getting educated and learning about it and ultimately making their choices, and food companies hopefully will follow suit.
We have a last set of slides we want to go over. I think we may have gone over some of this, but if we can run those. So that's an interesting slide.
Yeah, I mean, I think this
tells you the
synergies with organic food consumers. I mean, it's a big part of why people are buying organic. They want to avoid GMOs. It's a very important consideration for organic consumers.
Maybe this is good for your company. I'm thinking that having these GMO guys around has a built-in market for you.
I don't know, but they, I just assume to see less of them out there. So.
All right, so we did talk about maintaining consumer trust and the supply chain of avoidance practices and preserving the seed supply, which I think, as you point out, is a major national security issue.
Yeah, well, we have to unfortunately, spend some money, have testing regimens that are allowing our supply chain to have less and less contamination. I think everybody kind of had their head in the sand for the last 10 or 12 years, and what we find now when we test a lot of products is there is trace contamination in a lot of products. So again, going through some kind of regimen like the project, where there's testing of the seed and there's testing at the at the farm, we can eliminate this. It's not a hopeless situation. A lot of people think, oh, they're out there, they're never, we're never going to get back to pure. That's not the case. We can definitely clean this up.
And do we have another one there? So that's the label you guys would like to use.
Yeah, we have, I think, 6,000 products right now, either enrolled or verified. A lot of the companies are putting this symbol on their product. You should be seeing it more and more. And when you see this symbol, it just means that those products have gone through a rigorous testing, program, and that it meets the non-GMO standard, which is very similar to the EU standard of it's less than 0.9%,
right.
And it's a big improvement over what we had before, which was basically there was no testing being done at all.
Sure, would be nice to do a comparison run for a retailer who has both GMO and organic labeled, to see which identical product actually sells more over a given period of time. I mean, I would bet that they'll begin to see organic sales rising, even though it may be slightly more expensive.
Yeah,
as a percentage, I think that's true.
No, I think it's very true. And products that are showing up with the non-GMO verified seal, sales data is showing that there's a significant increase. Right. Consumers are really responding to it.
Right. So we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. What would you say, Michael, are the 3 things you'd like people to do?
Well, I think, purchasing organic food and looking for non-GMO verified products, letting your retailers know that these are products you want to buy, that you want to avoid GMOs, letting companies know. Sometimes if you're buying a cornflake or a soy milk, one of the primary at-risk products, and you see that it's not in a non-GMO verified program, let those companies know. Write them a letter, send them an email, and that has an impact. There's a couple of things. There's a Just Label It petition. That link there you can go to is an FDA petition. That's basically saying we want mandatory labeling of our food. If it's got GMOs on it, we want to know, like Europe, that they're in there. That's kind of while there may not be any action from there, it's a message to Washington that we are forced. I think we have 400,000 people that have signed on that the last couple months. It'd be nice to get a couple million people on that.
We have an initiative coming up.
There's an initiative in California that you're going to be hearing about that they're going to be qualifying for the November ballot, which is a mandatory label law in California only. And as we know, what happens in California generally influences the whole nation. If we can pass that in November, potentially could be a big game changer. Mm-hmm. So, there are a number of things to do, but probably primarily it's just getting the awareness and understanding what's happening. Like you say, this has just hit us in the last 10 years, has changed dramatically agriculture, and we really need to take another look at it and ask ourselves, is this the direction we want to keep going?
Right. Well, I hope everyone at home hears us and gets involved in learning more. That's about all we have time for. I want to thank the crew, thank my guest, Michael Funk. Mm-hmm. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Paul. Mm-hmm.
And that's another edition of Nevada County Interviews. Until next time, Paul Minicucci saying bye-bye.